Anyway, thank you so much, Chiara. So exciting, and what an honor to be in Lambeth here with you all today. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nikhil Chowdhury, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Cambridge University. We wanted to open with Nikhil because we want to make sure that we start out with the very basics. Why do we as a species and need so much in our childhood? What is childhood? It seems like we're the only mammal who has this extended period in the beginning of our lives when we are extremely vulnerable, and yet we are also the species that are not exactly putting that much or not enough emphasis on this period. So I would like to welcome Nikhil, who will tell us about his field research in this area, and please help me welcome him.
Cool. It doesn't go on the screen, does it, the pointer? Oh, you can see it? Okay, perfect. My absolute honor to be here and super excited for what's to come over the next couple of days. And what I'm hoping to do in this opening talk is just give you a new way to think about what childhood actually is, right? So I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, and what that really means is I try and identify what are the defining characteristics of our species, of humanity, what separates us from other species, and why did these characteristics, these defining characteristics, evolve in our species, right? Why are the things that make humans unique found in humanity but not in other species? Just for clarity, I don't think humans are special, but we're not uniquely unique, but we're unique, and many species are unique. So basically, the way I try and answer this question of the defining characteristics of humanity and why they evolved in humans is by working with hunter-gatherers. And so these are the Bayaka pygmy hunter-gatherers who live in the Congo rainforest, and I've been working with them for about 12 years now. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. I've been working with them for about 12 years now, and the reason hunter-gatherers are so informative to the kinds of questions I'm asking is because humans lived as hunter-gatherers for the vast majority of our history as a species. So we've been around for around 300,000 years, and we only developed agriculture about 10,000 years ago, and we've been living in cities for, not even the blink of an eye on an evolutionary timescale. So when we're trying to understand why something evolved in humans, we're effectively asking the question of how did some characteristic improve survival or reproductive prospects, because these are the currencies of evolution. How did they improve survival or reproductive prospects in a hunter-gatherer context? Because that's the context we've lived in for most of our history. And what I'm going to show you is that childhood is most certainly one of the defining characteristics of our species, and we can see very clearly the evolutionary function it serves and why it evolved in our species. And the other reason I work with hunter-gatherers is a bit more on the practical side and looking at the downstream effects of the answers to those questions, which relate to this idea of evolutionary mismatch. So evolutionary mismatch is this concept in evolutionary biology, which is that organisms through evolution adapt to certain environmental pressures and environmental conditions, but natural selection is a very slow process. Right? You're waiting for ages for some random mutation. 99.9% of random mutations do absolutely nothing. Occasionally there's one which helps us adapt to the environment, and then it can take thousands of generations to become widespread in the species. Right? So it's very slow, which results in this adaptive lag. When we're exposed to new conditions, there's a discordance between the environmental conditions we're adapted to and the environmental conditions we're exposed to. And that puts us at risk of disease and pathology. So classic example of evolutionary mismatch. And bear in mind, yes, we were hunter-gatherers for most of our history as a species, but also deeper in our evolutionary history, these other ancestral species, which are part of our lineage, were also hunter-gatherers. They didn't do farming or live in cities. So the classic example of evolutionary mismatch is, as hunter-gatherers, it's super important to get hold of sugars and fats. They're scarce in the environment and obviously really important for our growth and health. So we all evolved, we are all descendants of ancestors who had genetic predispositions towards enjoying sugars and fats, because those were the individuals who sought out these foods and gained the health benefits of them in an environment where they were scarce but valuable. And now very suddenly, we're living in an environment where they're abundant and readily available, but we have these mismatched taste preferences. So we've got these dispositions which lead us to want to eat loads of sugars and fats because now they're easy to get hold of, but in the past they weren't. And that leads to all sorts of health issues which we're all familiar with. So hopefully that clarifies this concept of evolutionary mismatch. And now I want to relate all of this to childhood. So what is childhood? When we look at our closest relatives, the other great apes, what you can see in this diagram is that we can split their life course into three sections: I, J, and then this darker patch, which is A, adulthood. So I is infancy, J is, so infancy basically means the offspring is still breastfeeding. J is the juvenile period where they finish breastfeeding and they're largely nutritionally self-sufficient, but they haven't yet reached sexual maturity and adulthood from a biological perspective. And what you can see in the human developmental life history is we have this, there's no J, and we have this C, so childhood. So we have this unique period that isn't found in other primate relatives of ours, where after infancy, we are not self-sufficient. And we can split this childhood period, so the C, into, I've realized it's not very clear to see, but that's a C. We can split this childhood period into two sections, and I'll talk about each of them individually and what their function is. But basically, this first period, that second dotted line reflects, if we extrapolated the primate pattern, this is when we would expect weaning to occur, when we'd expect a child to stop breastfeeding. But actually, if you look in humans and look at hunter-gatherers, we typically stop breastfeeding at around 2.5, rather than what would be expected, which is about 6.5. And the reason this period evolved is because if a child isn't just dependent on their mother's milk, it means other members of the community can help raise that child. The child isn't tied constantly to the mother and entirely dependent on the mother. So by evolution shifting our infancy period, the weaning, earlier, and creating this new period of childhood where we're still dependent, but not just dependent on our mother, through this opportunity for the community to raise kids, we were able to reproduce at relatively fast rates and have these highly dependent offspring still be cared for and have decent chances of survival. So that's the first concept of why childhood, the first reason we can understand this first component of childhood and how it evolved, right? Because it allowed for alloparenting or allomothering. That's to say, other mothers or other parents were able to get involved in raising children. The burden wasn't just on the mothers. And I don't know whether this is a Mac. It's not displaying quite correctly. But anyway, I can freestyle this. There was a graph there which basically was meant to highlight just how prevalent alloparenting is in hunter-gatherer societies. So I observed children for 12 hours, and basically, in a fairly soul-destroying process, every 20 seconds, I would write down every single thing that child did, every individual that child interacted with, and what that interaction was. And I was looking in particular at caregiving behaviors and breaking this down into proximity. So how many potential caregivers were within 3 meters an eye shot of a child at any given time? And that was about 15 different individuals over a 12-hour period. How many individuals had physical contact with the child? That was about 8 to 10 individuals. These are 0 to 4-year-olds, so infants and toddlers. How many individuals gave hands-on, attentive care to the child, like soothing the child, carrying the child, bathing the child? Again, that was 8 to 10 individuals other than the mother over the course of 12 hours. And then how many individuals responded to children's crying? And that was about 4 individuals other than the mother. And you can see here in this graph on your right-hand side, the red bars are the whole sample, blues infants and greens toddlers. Don't pay too much attention to that, but the red is the entire sample, and the number above the bar is the percentage of bouts who that individual responded to, crying bouts. So basically the takeaway is that mothers responded to less than 50% of a child's cry. In the other cases, someone other than the mother responded to the cry, or someone helped the mother do that. And again, in this graph in the bottom, this table in the bottom, which isn't displaying quite as I expected, you can see, well, you can't fully see, but basically the key takeaway is that children are getting loads of sensitive caregiving, this child-centered, hands-on care, where roughly 40 to 50% of that care is coming from individuals other than the parents, and that's allowing these kids to get about, the infants are getting about 9 hours of physical contact with a caregiver, toddlers about 7 hours, hands-on care, again, 9 hours for infants. So they're getting an incredible amount of attention. And this, I don't know what's going on here. Are we showing this on a Mac or something? I don't know. This displayed fine on my computer and my friend's computer, but I can just freestyle it. I do know what the slides say. Okay, so the question is there a mismatch here, right? Is there a mismatch between what these hunter-gatherer children were experiencing and what they're adapted to, what we're adapted to, and what's going on in cities? And I'd argue yes, because one, when we look at the data, children are getting less sensitive care and much less physical contact than their hunter-gatherer counterparts, which is entirely expected given that they've, in a nursery, you've got one caregiver to about 3 or 4 children compared to ratios of, 10 to 1. In the other direction, where you've got 10 caregivers to 1 children. And sensitive caregiving is associated with a whole suite of positive mental health outcomes. But I think who are struggling the most as a result of this mismatch is, of course, the mothers. We have a situation at the moment where in the UK, more than 20% of mothers are suffering with a perinatal mental health problem, right? So that is just insane. When almost, a quarter of of a given demographic are having what could be diagnosed as a mental illness, something is wrong. So there's clearly a mismatch there. And unsurprisingly, one of the most, if not the number one, risk factor for postnatal depression and postnatal anxiety is a lack of social support. Something that hunter-gatherer mothers throughout our evolutionary history didn't need to worry about. This, of course, then has knock-on effects for the children because intergenerational transmission of mental health problems is becoming more and more apparent. If the mother struggles with her mental health, so does the child. And 5 minutes, got to go fast then. So I'll leave it at that, right? So there's a mismatch in terms of alloparenting. Now, the second part of childhood is this second bar of C, which is that even if we did get weaned and infancy ended when we'd expect at about 6.5 years, we're still dependent on caregivers right up until adulthood. We don't have this juvenile period of self-sufficiency. We need to be looked after and we need to be provisioned. And the reason for that is, again, to do with the hunter-gatherer diet. So you can see here in the graph in the top right, we can break down foods by whether they're easy to acquire and collected, like leaves and fruit, whether they're extracted, which is slightly more nutrient dense, so like digging for tubers or cracking nuts, and requires a bit more skill, or whether they're hunted, which is the most nutrient dense, but also requires the most amount of skill. So that's an oversimplification, but the main point in that graph is that unlike our primate relatives, we relied on a much more nutrient-dense diet, but a diet which required a lot more skill to acquire those nutrients. And as such, we evolved this extended developmental period of dependence prior to adulthood, in which we learned the skills necessary for this highly skilled and complex subsistence mode. So really, that extra period of childhood evolved so that children could learn the complex skills for hunting and gathering that made our species so successful. And how did they learn? The graph in the bottom corner is based on video data where we quantified the different modes of learning of different skills. And the key takeaway is that those purple bars are very small, i.e. skills aren't taught, but what happens the most are those green bars, which stand for play and practice. That's how hunter-gatherer children learn, right? So from about the age of 2 all the way to late adolescence, these toddlers, children, and adolescents are spending the day in these mixed-age play groups, largely unsupervised by adults, where they go off and explore the forest and play, but play in a way that develops skills. You can see these boys here have fashioned spears, which they're practicing their hunting on insects with. These other boys have built vine harnesses to practice climbing trees. 13 years later, last year I saw this boy again, and now he's using those same harnesses to climb 40-meter high trees to collect honey. So childhood evolved, that extra bit of dependence evolved so that children could engage with the environment in this unstructured, unsupervised way and play, but play in a way that allows them to develop skills. And I'll speak 2 minutes and then I can finish up. And I think there's clearly a mismatch there, right? When we look at how children learn in our society, it's teacher-led, it's passive, so there's no activity. We actually have a dichotomy, a formalized dichotomy between lesson time and playtime is about an hour of the school day. So it's no wonder school is really boring, basically. It's fun, but it's fun because you're with your friends at playtime. Lessons themselves are boring. Of course, I'm not suggesting we just go around in the garden all day, because you're not going to learn trigonometry that day. But if we're not fulfilling that need in how we learn, we need to fulfill it some other way. And there's more and more evidence, as I'm sure you guys know better than I do, and as we've already heard, that children are spending less and less time outdoors fulfilling these needs of exploring the environment in these mixed-age settings, and as such spending more time on their phone. And we know that this outdoor play is associated with better social and emotional development, lower risk of a whole range of mental health issues, and of course, better physical health through increased exercise. So I think there's clearly a mismatch there. And also, I think what's underrated is the importance of this play between individuals of different ages, which they don't get at school, but they're learning the responsibility of caring for younger kids, right? They're not faced with having a baby and thinking, I have no idea what I'm doing and how to care for someone, because they've had 20 years of experience looking after younger kids. So I think that's another form of mismatch. So to conclude, what is childhood? It's a unique period in the human developmental schedule that evolutionary biologists consider has been absolutely fundamental to our success as a species, because it allowed us to collectively raise highly dependent offspring at fast rates with decent survival prospects through supporting mothers. It allowed an extended period for children to learn the complex skills that brought back these nutrient-dense resources by having 17, 18 years to play with their friends, explore their environment unsupervised in an unstructured way, but all that time playing in such a way that develops these skills. And for these functions of childhood to be fulfilled, natural selection endowed our psychology, our brain, our hormones, and the resultant needs so that these functions can be fulfilled. And because of the lack of communal caregiving and the decline in multi-age group, explorative, active play, those needs aren't being met. And we can physically see in our bodies through a number of biomarkers that those needs aren't being met. So I'll leave it there, but hopefully you've got a new way to think about what childhood is, that it's unique, and that it evolved for two very specific functions, neither of which are happening in our society. So thank you very much.